Please be advised, this podcast contains graphic audio and themes that may not be appropriate for all listeners.
After the disaster, Ben Conark dug back into the Herald's own archives to see how it had covered the project and the people involved over the decades.
When we first find out that the building was constructed in 1980, 1981, the idea of going back in time 40 years, it seems like how can we possibly do this? But the more time you spend kind of digging into the archives, it's actually kind of amazing how many clues you can amass by just backgrounding the people, backgrounding the towns, the other work they did. And there are reasons based on the people who were in charge of these things to suspect that maybe there wasn't the best oversight at Champlain South.
One of the key players was Sergio Breiterman. He's the man Reiber picked to be his structural engineer.
So Sergio Breiterman was, born in Cuba. He was a Jewish immigrant to Miami in the late 60s, and kind of an upstart engineer. We followed everything we could find about him in clippings, and his, he went from designing kind of small residential structures to medical office buildings.
In 1974, Breiterman won the contract for the public safety building in Coral Gables, about 40 minutes south of Surfside. In 2014, when the building was inspected, serious problems were found. There were cracks in the basement floor, there was corrosion in the reinforcement, and there were major issues in the parking garage. In fact, the garage was so bad that the city had been parking its fire trucks outside, worried that the structure might collapse.
This project actually ended up being like a pretty key part of unwinding the history of Champlain South. There are a lot of issues with it pretty much from the start. It smells like a wet dog. There's hairline cracks in the concrete slabs. And when they start trying to figure out what went wrong, they discover that it's lacking concrete reinforcement on some of the walls, which is a big deal because let's say you're returning from a trip or whatever, and you accidentally take the car out of park and lunge forward and you hit this concrete wall in a parking garage. Well, the reinforcement's there to make sure your car doesn't plummet over the edge of the building onto the street below. But Sergio Breiterman basically shrugged that off. So this turns into a pretty serious controversy in about 1976. Sergio Breiterman was interviewed by the Herald at the time, and he said he couldn't remember if he had inspected that part of the construction work. And he basically said that it wasn't part of the structural component of the parking garage.
Conark ran that by some structural engineers, and they strongly disagreed.
Two people used a word I'm not sure I'm allowed to say on the podcast. They described it as BS, that for Breiterman to kind of shrug off his responsibility, while he might not have been the person responsible for placing all the concrete reinforcement, that would be the contractor. But as the engineer over this building, it absolutely was his responsibility to make sure that reinforcement was placed properly. And that didn't seem to be something that he took seriously. It's a concerning revelation when you find out that the engineer didn't have that sense of ownership or that sense of urgency about knowing exactly where and how this parking garage, which later would have major issues and need to be torn down. He didn't really take ownership over knowing where all the reinforcement in that building was. It's a window into the mind of the people who were in charge of making sure this building was properly constructed.
6 years later, Breiterman was an important member of Reiber's team. And then there's the architect Reiber tapped. He didn't exactly have a spotless resume either.
The architect on Champlain South was a guy by the name of William Friedman, relatively little known from Miami, had been doing business since the 60s. We discovered pretty early on that he had a bit of a checkered past.
In 1965, Florida's Board of Architects slapped Friedman with a 6-month suspension. That was after a side structure he designed blew off a building during Hurricane Betsy. The report cited gross incompetence, negligence, and carelessness.
In the 1970s, he was designing small 1 or 2 story structures, but really hadn't designed anything like this at the time when he designed Champlain South. He was kind of a nobody, plucked out of obscurity. So you start to wonder, how can a guy with relatively little experience, who has this kind of questionable mark on his record, be put in this position to design the first of its kind high-rise residential tower in this kind of sleepy town of Surfside, Florida. And we just don't know why they ended up going with William Friedman. But we do know that they picked him in the late 70s and they stuck with him until the 90s. And it made some people scratch their heads. And the result was a scattering of L-shaped residential towers in Surfside that now all have giant question marks hanging over them. And they're all within this stretch of about 7 blocks.
Reporter Andres Viglucci.
Did he overlook possible weak spots? Did he overlook possible hazards? Did they realize that they were making mistakes in the design and then compounding them with poor quality construction? That seems likely, but it's speculation at this point. It can't really be pinned down given the lack of records and the fact that most of these folks are gone. And there's very little record of him today. If you look at the various architecture guides to Miami buildings that cover quite a lot of ground, his name never comes up. He is not a guy who was especially well regarded then as one of the top architects and almost unknown today, save for Champlain Towers, ironically.